Hello class, welcome to Classical Mythology, HRS 119. I'll be your instructor, Matthias Warnes. In this introductory lecture, we're going to give an overview of the field of classical myth. Basically, this is a survey course in Greco-Roman myth, and we'll as well go over theories of myth and the history of Greco-Roman myth interpretation, focusing on some of the critical problems we're likely to encounter across this course in approaching any given myth. Unfortunately, my recording software, Camtasia, doesn't allow me to apply snap camera filters and be a sprightly mythological creature for the entirety of this course, but you get the basic idea. So what is classical mythology and why take a course in it? According to the Greek National Tourism Organization, the best benefit of taking a course like this is then to go off and live your myth in Greece. Quote, Greece, a land of mythical dimensions where the spirit of hospitality welcomes you as a modern god. And the siren's song draws you into its deep blue waters, where a gentle breeze through ancient ruins seems to whisper your name, and a dance until dawn can take on Dionysian proportions. In Greece, the myths are still very much alive, and in amongst them sits your own, patiently waiting for you to live it. Live your myth in Greece. Ask your travel agent. This funny tourism advert is how Helen Morales starts her classical mythology, a very short introduction, commenting, we might think that the advert has scant respect for mythological tradition. To be drawn down into deep blue waters by a siren's song was to meet certain death, which is why the hero Odysseus plugged up the ears of his crew and tied himself to the ship's mast before sailing by the seductive singers. And a dance that takes on Dionysian proportions is probably best avoided, as we'll learn from Pentheus, when he was ripped limb from limb by his mother, one of Dionysus's dancing worshippers. But to respond to the advert with academic pedantry is to miss the point. What it is selling is a particular image of Greece and of myth, one of pleasure, prestige, mystique, and fantasy. Pleasure, prestige, mystique, and fantasy, huh? Sounds like pretty good reasons to study classical myth. But tell me, Socrates, by Zeus, do you believe this story is true? Asks the young Phaedrus to the older Socrates under the plane tree by the river Ilissus in Plato's dialogue The Phaedrus. And here we can begin the long process of scratching our heads about what is mythology and the relation of myth and truth. For aren't myths supposed to be tall tales, fabrications, beautiful or disturbing lies? And isn't this precisely why we love it? What entertaining fictions! This modern way of understanding the basic concept of myth is not foreign to, but certainly not central in the way the archaic and classical Greeks understood it. We can define the Greek term mythos, muthos, in terms of a number of different root meanings in our own language. Story, saga, saying, or word. But just saying that myth is story, saga, saying, or word doesn't really tell us very much about the distinctive nature of myth and the type of meaning involved in mythic saying, or how this meaning differs from, say, providing a logos or rational explanation of the myth. The term mythos has heroic connotations, as in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, but it also refers to theological or cosmological sayings, a laying out of the basic structure of the cosmos, the gods, and the history of mortals within it. In the basic term mythology, we actually have two terms quite often at variance in the archaic and classical tradition, on the one hand mythos, and on the other logos. While other logi words seem to have clear rationality, such as biology, zoology, paleontology, etc., the task being to give a logos sub to make some sense about the sphere of bios, life, animality in general, zoe, or the distant past, the term mythology may be considered already a kind of oxymoron or contradiction in terms. Isn't myth supposed to be opposed to reason, the mythos to the logos, the fantastic tale to its disenchantment and demythologizing in reason? We'll talk more about the history of these two terms, mythos and logos, in a minute. Next, we need to make some finer distinctions within the types of myth that we deal with in this course. Scholars often speak, for heuristic purposes, of the difference between true myth and historical legend. True myth involves tales of the gods, the cosmos, and human beings, theogony, cosmogony, and anthropogony. That is, it gives a universal account of the nature of the universe. And this type of myth we find a lot in Greco-Roman myth, often distinguishable and often intertwined with things like saga, legend, folktale, or fairy tale. A great deal hinges in the type of myth we're studying on whether it's part of an oral tradition or written down and canonized, whether it's based on folk tale or has become an official version. And next we can note that mythology is very often communicated with music and poetry. It is, in a certain sense, the meaning script or arca art underlying the development of all the other arts. Not just music and poetry, but also sculpture and dance, as well as the rich paintings invariably based in myth, which deck out the temple in which the myth is ritually performed. This Greek term musike, meaning deriving from the muses, is very close to the Greek term mythos in a lot of ways. So many of the primary source myths we're going to cover in this class, we're going to read on the page or hear about in a lecture, but it will be important to apply your imagination to the inspiration and the performative context for these myths. Maybe even to put on some music, read them aloud, and dance around yourself. Consistent with the textbook's definition of true myths, as having to do with gods, mortals, or the cosmos, I really like what the German philosopher Martin Heidegger says on the basic concept of mythos. In his Parmenides lectures, he writes, "Mythos is legend, this word taken in the sense of essential primordial speech." This definition of mythos or mythic saying as essential primordial speech may not apply equally well to all instances of the word mythos in our archaic or classical sources, but it applies fairly well to most of them. Mythic speech is essential primordial speech. That is, it reveals both the essence and the origin of things in their appearance or manifestation. Heidegger's examples here are some pretty basic words in any language, words like night, light, or earth. We use these words every day, but when we utter them, essentially and primordially, we are uttering a mythos. This concept of mythic saying as essential primordial speech is quite similar, in fact, to J.R.R. Tolkien's concept of mythopoeia. As he explains in a letter to C.S. Lewis, "You look at trees," he said, "and call them trees, and probably you do not think twice about the word. You call a star, and think nothing more of it. But you must remember that these words, tree, star, were in their original forms names given to these objects by people with a very different view from yours. To you, a tree is simply a vegetable organism, and a star simply a ball of inanimate matter moving along a mathematical course. But the first men to talk of trees and stars saw things very differently. They saw the stars as living silver, bursting into flame in answer to the eternal music. They saw the sky as a jeweled tent, and the earth as the womb whence all living things have come. To them, the whole of creation was myth-woven and elf-patterned." The difference which Tolkien underlines to Lewis between the desacralized everyday use of language and the archaic perception built into the root meanings of our words as sayings corresponds pretty well here to what Heidegger means by mythos as essential primordial saying. Night, light, and earth, when essentially spoken, can become mythoi, not merely images for concealing and unveiling, images which pre-philosophical thinking does not transcend, but rather concealment and unconcealedness are in advance experienced in such an essential way that just the simple change of night and day suffices to enhance the emergence of all essence into the preserving word, mythos. Human life is constantly embedded in transitions between night and day, light and darkness, earth and sky, and these transformations go on all around us, very often without even our noticing them. When we utter these same words in a mythos, however, we enter into the play of language which conceals and unconceals the meaning of these words. And so Heidegger goes on, the distinction between light and darkness remains unmythical, unless first of all clearness and concealment already appear as the essence of the light and the dark, and along with them that which comes into the light and recedes into the darkness, appearing in such a way that precisely this coming into light and this receding into darkness make up the essence in which all presence and all absence dwell. Now you may think this sounds like a lot of mumbo-jumbo, but if you think about it, this definition of mythic speech or mythopoeia as essential primordial speech is itself mythical. And here we can ask, should it not be so? For if we try to privilege a definition of myth that focuses on explaining the sense of myth non-mythically, we will have left the realm of myth itself. Perhaps a mythical definition of myth is the best we can do if our goal is to actually learn to think and experience in a mythical way. Note also, this mythical definition of mythic speech is fairly closely related to the biblical myth of the naming power of language given to Adam by God when he renames everything in God's creation, attempting to bring the names of things closer to the ineffable Word of God. Not just the Greco-Roman, but the Judeo-Christian definition of mythic speech essentially cohere on this point. For Heidegger, in short, the mythical, or in Tolkien, mythopoetic use of language happens when we deal with a primordial saying that shelters all our essential relations, such that the very words of our language, like earth, death, light, and night, and even the names of the gods, come to have a function of revealing and concealing at the same time. Hopefully, in studying the material for this course, you'll eventually learn to read some of it as Heidegger suggests here. This is again a deeper way of explaining what the textbook understands as true myth. That is, tales that truly reveal something about the world that are essential primordial sayings, and so not always the same thing as entertaining epics of the heroes or the fantastic stories of folklore or fairy tale. Only one thing is certain, our textbook underlines: no single theory of myth can cover all kinds of myth, and this because the variety of traditional tales is matched by the variety of their origins and significance. We may want to make clear-cut distinctions between myth proper and heroic epic, folklore, or fairy tale, but very often our sources mix these genres together, often in surprising and innovative ways. And as to the general definition of myth, the textbook is less ambitious than Heidegger or Tolkien. Such definitions will tend to be either too limiting or so broad as to be virtually useless. In the last analysis, which of course means here in the cognitive or logical approach to myth, definitions are only enlightening when they succeed in identifying particular characteristics of different types of stories and so provide criteria for classification. I tend to think that Heidegger or Tolkien's definition of myth or mythopoeia as essential primordial speech or deep revealing to be useful and succinct, but I understand where the textbook is coming from here. Just as myth proper concerning the gods, the origin of the cosmos, and the destiny of humanity is often so interwoven with heroic epic in Homer and Hesiod, for instance, it's sometimes almost impossible to parse them out. So the types of mythic narratives and thinkings we find in folktale and fairy tale quite often flesh out or even challenge dominant traditions. In folktales and fairy tales, we find stories of adventure, peopled with fantastic beings, and enlivened by ingenious strategies on the part of a hero or heroine who will always triumph in the end. While their goal seems primarily to entertain, these types of myths can sometimes also contain deep allegories, not only regarding human society, but also nature or the gods. Students have a tendency to like the folktale or fairy tale aspect of myth better because it's more relatable and personal. In these types of myths, we find characters familiar to us all: the monstrous giant, the wicked sorceress, the distraught maiden in peril, and the special powers of her saviors, the wicked sisters, mistaken identity, the imposition of labors, the solving of riddles, and the fulfillment of romantic love, and so on. Among the many folk tales covered in our textbook, the tale of Cupid and Psyche will stand out, this being the literal origin of the genre of storytelling that begins once upon a time and ends happily ever after. If your primary interest in taking a classical mythology class is to hear great once upon a time stories like this, you won't be completely disappointed, but on the other hand, the serious study of myth will turn out, as we'll see, to be a much more involved affair than simply telling tales and working out their allegorical meaning. Plot is indeed important in myth, but very often, as we'll see, will take a back seat to existential and religious concerns. Next, the textbook notes that myth is almost never pure. Rarely, if ever, do we find a pristine, uncontaminated example of any one of the forms of true myth, heroic legend, folktale, or fairy tale. Still, the basic categories of myth, saga, and folktale can be useful guides to impose some sort of order on the multitudinous variety of classical tales. How loose these categories are can be seen, for example, in the legends of Odysseus or of the Argonauts, which contain many elements of history or saga, but are full of stories that may be designated as true myths on the one hand, or folktales on the other. Here, criteria for definition merge, and the lines of demarcation blur. So what are some of the questions addressed by mythology? Well, more or less everything. Things like, how did the universe, the world, and human beings come to be? What we tend to think of as cosmology or ontology, theory of what is, what exists. Myths also address questions of who we are and what our proper and necessary or inescapable roles are in the cosmos, what we generally call anthropology. Myths address questions of how we should act or not act, and what are the consequences, things we normally call ethics, morality, or aesthetics, as well as questions of who the important actors are in the drama of both universal and local history. Myths very often making up the core of human cultural identities. Indeed, uncountable answers to these and other questions are embedded in myth. So when you take a mythology class, it's kind of invariably like taking a philosophy or a religious studies class as well. Indeed, studying our historical myths can be a bit like cultural reclamation, but it can also go terribly wrong, as we'll see. The insights provided by mythology are various and profound. All global mythologies will be focusing here on the Greco-Roman myths, of course, provide us with metaphysical insights about human limits and mortality, our relationship to God and death, cosmological insights, founding cosmogonic myths being the form that science took in those days. Myths are replete with sociological insights helping us to understand humans in groups or social units, psychological insights, the very nature of this human psyche. Sometimes myth will contain verifiable or unverifiable historical details, etc., etc., etc. Insights provided by myth are, in our sense, thoroughly interdisciplinary, since in a very real way, myth was the archidiscipline of human knowledge, out of which all the other disciplines, including philosophy, eventually separated themselves. And when taking a classical mythology class, we're of course going to have to think very frequently in an interdisciplinary way, drawing insights from psychologists, sociologists, folklorists, scientists, philosophers, artists, and many others. If you go to the library for each of these areas, you'll find a distinctive contribution of that field to the study of myth, usually even a subsection on contributions to studies in Greco-Roman myth. So the required textbook for this course is the Morford, Linarden and Sham Classical Mythology, 10th edition. It's cheaper than the 11th edition, which actually cuts out some important chapters from it. So I would recommend getting this one, although earlier editions are sometimes okay if you're really on a budget. We'll generally use this textbook to get the big picture, but the course pack to go into more detail. You can download the course pack on my website in a single PDF, but you'll also find it broken down into week-to-week PDFs in our course modules. Primary source texts that are not required but recommended include Apostolos Athanasakis' excellent translations of the primary myths themselves, Hesiod, the Orphic hymns, and the Homeric hymns. Lots of excerpts from the Hesiod and many of the complete Homeric hymns you'll also find in our textbook, but it can be very valuable to have A, an alternative translation, and B, a complete text to work from. I'll often provide Orphic hymns in the slides and lectures and discuss them, but the textbook doesn't cover them very much, and they're probably the single most readable and beautiful source for a beginner student, so if you were going to get one of these three texts, I would say it should be the Orphic hymns. Lastly, although we only have 1 week on it, Homer's Odyssey in the Lattimore or Fitzgerald or Lombardo translation would also make this course a lot more fun. Some of you may be taking this course because of a background interest in Greek mythology. Perhaps you had Edith Hamilton's book Mythology kicking about in your house when you grew up. Perhaps you learned a little about it in school. Perhaps you got into the Percy Jackson series. No, we won't be covering that here. Or perhaps most of what you know about Greek mythology comes from popular films, or even Assassin's Creed Odyssey on Xbox. It can definitely help to correct common prejudices and assumptions to listen on Audible to a real storyteller's attempt to lay out this material, such as Robert Graves' monumental, although problematic, The Greek Myths, or Roberto Colasso's The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony. We'll be getting a taster from the Colasso next week. As to more academic monographs covering more or less the whole field of Greek myth, I particularly recommend Carl Karenyi's The Gods of the Greeks and Walter Friedrich Otto's The Homeric Gods. Of course, in a 15-week course, we have to be selective, so the course pack will include from these only a taster chapter from Colasso and the first part of Otto's book, The Homeric Gods. If there's any Audible subscribers out there and you have a few extra credits, you might want to pick up the teaching company's Great Mythologies of the World, which covers classical and global myth, as well as myth and human history. Both might be fun to listen to as you work through the material in this course. According to Leonard and McClure at the outset of their textbook Myth and Knowing, we are ever, when approaching myth, approaching a very complicated history. Quote, "The history of mythology is a tale told by idiots, but also by sages, religious fundamentalists and agnostic theologians, idealists and cynics, racists and fascists, philosophers and scholars. Myth has been understood as containing the secrets of God, the cultural DNA responsible for a people's identity, a means of organizing human knowledge, and a justification for European and American efforts to colonize and police the world." This course will cohere with Leonard and McClure in approaching Greek and Roman myth in particular as, quote, literary truths told about the mysteries of human life. In order to explain these literary truths about mystery in life, we'll need, of course, an interdisciplinary approach, for it takes concerted effort to peel away and examine the religious, philosophical, social, political, historical, psychological, cultural, functional, and literary layers of any given myth onion. So back to our question of myth and truth. On the one hand, we all seem to have built in an understanding of myth as silly, primitive, fictional storytelling. Or to speak with Aristotle's use of the term mythos as mere plot, events that happen in the course of a narrative. On the other hand, in a course like this, we have to deal with the understanding of myth, mythic saying, as pointing to some kind of highest reality. And here, of course, myth comes to loggerheads immediately with science, truth, reality, and facts. And the standard dismissal we all use in everyday discourse, that's just a myth. Indeed, since the pre-Socratic philosophers, as we'll see, there's been a battle raging between mythic and scientific or more rational attitudes. And this battle is far from over even in the 21st century. We'll learn in this course how Plato's philosophical vision of the world is in fact just as mythical as it is rational or logical. And we'll also learn how all theology, all religious conceptions of a god or the gods, have mythical bases. According to the textbook, and I tend to agree, the thoughtless dismissal of myth as untruth, as fiction, as mere lie, is the most barren and misleading definition of them all. Martha Graham, a famous 20th century dancer and choreographer and reinventor of ancient Greek mythic dances, goes so far as to suggest that the discoveries of science will in time change and perhaps grow obsolete, such as when there are fundamental paradigm shifts in the sciences, but mythic art is eternal, for it reveals the inner landscape, which is the soul of man. To really get into this thorny problem of the relation of myth and truth in human existence, we'll need in the course back at times to defer to more qualified interpreters. Foremost among them in this course will be Pierre Vernot and his work Myth and Thought Among the Greeks, and Marcel Deschamps, his work The Masters of Truth in Archaic Greece. So we've already seen, repeated in the textbook's definition of true myth, Heidegger on Mythos, there seems to be an inextricable link between myth and religion. As the textbook puts it, true myth, as distinguished from saga and folktale, is primarily concerned with the gods, religion, and the supernatural. Most Greek and Roman stories reflect this universal preoccupation with creation, the nature of God and humankind, the afterlife, and other spiritual concerns. Thus, mythology and religion are inextricably intertwined. Indeed, as we'll see in this course, mythic texts are almost invariably religious texts. Greeks lived their myth as religion, and made no distinction between myth and religion in the modern sense. Not just for the Greeks, but for indigenous cultures the world over, mythic scriptures are scriptures per se. In fact, for the Greeks, as also for some of us in the modern period, myth is believed not only factually, but spiritually. Quote, specific creation stories and mythical conceptions of deity may still be considered true today and provide the dogma for devout religious belief in a contemporary society. We don't often hear about devout Hellenists, for example, because of course globally they're in a vast minority, not even a major world religion. But there are in fact a sizable number of people on planet Earth who still approach Greco-Roman myth religiously or spiritually, as liturgy and even as revealed religion. Looking back to archaic and classical times, the textbook notes that Greek and Roman religious ceremonies and cults were given authority by myths which inspired belief. Among the examples are the worship of Zeus at Olympia, Athena at Athens, and Demeter at Eleusis, as well as the celebration of mystery religions throughout the ancient world. Our textbook gives a pretty strong emphasis on the religious or ritual dimensions of myth in the Greco-Roman historical landscape, so we'll have a chance to explore all of these in more detail as we proceed through the course. So let's talk now a bit about theories of myth and the most widespread interpretations of myth across the historical landscape from ancient through medieval to the Renaissance, and from the modern to the postmodern. The three main doctrines for interpreting myth can be understood as the etiological, the euhemeristic, and the allegorical. These are words and ways of approaching myth you'll definitely need to memorize, because they'll come up again and again when we interpret any given myth. The etiological interpretation of myth from the Greek word for cause or aisha explains myths in terms of customs and facts. So, for example, when we ask about the specific details of a mythic story or ritual, why they differ between one city-state and another, Greeks will themselves on occasion explain it etiologically. We worship Apollo in this way because of these historical events or customs, while other city-states worship Apollo in another way on account of another etiological continuum. The etiological interpretation of myth focuses on the close link between myth and tradition and tends to be localist in emphasis. However, it often attempts to reconstruct a more archaic past or origin myth, accounting for the root source. The next major historically influential theory of myth is called Euhemerism, from the ancient philosopher and literary critic Euhemerus. According to Euhemerus, myths were disguised history. When we hear about the overthrow of the Titans by the Olympians and the establishment of the one king Zeus, what we are hearing is history exaggerated through time. There probably really was a king Kronos and a king Zeus, his son, once upon a time in some forgotten era. And the events rendered in the myth may have some kernels of historical truth, but they've been distorted or exaggerated to the point that the human actors which play in them have become veritable gods, and the meaning of the myth separates itself wholly from real history and becomes a kind of cosmic history. The Euhemeristic interpretation of myth was hardly plausible to the vast majority of Greeks and Romans. It was too reductionistic, but it came to play a major role in early Christian interpreters who were looking for a way to delegitimate the Greco-Roman body of pagan myths, at the same time tending to read their own Judeo-Christian myths as literal history. In fact, Hebrew Bible or Old Testament myths, much more often than the Greek sources, seem to lend themselves to Euhemeristic interpretation. The third most major theory is as sacred allegory, or the allegorical interpretation, from the Greek word allegoresis, to say one thing by means of another. Here, myth itself is the attempt to explain one thing by means of something else. The story we're reading may appear to be about events in the life of some distant historical Hercules, but really it is an allegory for the stages of development of the divine anthropos, or the fully divinized human being as Hercules will become in Greek myth. And each episode in the tale should be read through that lens as an allegory or sacred symbol. The allegorical interpretation of myth came to be the most fruitful, allowed in the way remnants or vestiges of Greco-Roman myth to survive during the rise of Christianity, down through the Renaissance rediscovery of allegory and into our present day. Whether we think about this consciously or not, whenever we read a myth, etiological, euhemeristic, and allegorical criteria of interpretation occur to us as a matter of course. We're always asking, what is the origin or historical root of this detail in the myth? Or, is this myth really about what it proposes to be about? Is it not about something else that has been distorted over time and which it can be reduced to? Or, what does this myth really mean? Is it an allegory or a symbol for something deeper that needs to be ferreted out through a close reading of the myth itself? Modern to postmodern interpretations of myth we'll look at in a moment include the psychoanalytic or psychological, such as Freud's complexes or Jung's archetypes of the collective unconscious, as well as the findings of the field of comparative religion, such as in Mircea Eliade's view that myths encode experiences of the sacred, or even structuralist and post-structuralist, or nowadays called postmodern interpretations of myth, such as when Levi Strauss argues that mythic language functions at a high level because of the complexity of structural oppositions it embeds, or when the postmodernists examine the play of mythical meanings. Here again, these most widespread interpretations of myth are ones we always already apply, often without even thinking about it. What is the psychological meaning of this myth? How does this myth and its religious meaning compare to other religions? What are the fundamental structures of this myth that I can analyze that appear to help the myth produce its meaning? And what can this myth do? How should we play with it in the context of a disenchanted modernity or a project for postmodern re-enchantment? Ideological, where does this myth come from? Euhemeristic, what is it really saying, even if it doesn't know that's what it's saying? Allegorical, what is it maybe saying, and why is that meaning important? Psychological, isn't it really about human beings ultimately and not the gods at all? Or what do the gods signify psychologically in the context of a myth? Comparative, how does this myth relate to my founding myths or other founding myths? Structuralist, let's look a bit more deeply into the details of the myth and how they produce meaning. And post-structuralist, how can I play with this myth? What does it do? To understand why the etiological, euhemeristic, allegorical, psychological, comparative, structuralist, and post-structuralist modes of interpretation seem to be already built into every modern human who approaches this myth, we need to look a bit more closely into the history of how these so seemingly common sense approaches came about. So let's look now to the historically changing meaning of myth and mythos in a bit more detail. Like in the interpretations of Heidegger and Tolkien covered above, in the ancient poet Hesiod from the 7th century BCE, the use of the term mython seems to designate primal words spoken by the muses to the poet. where these muses might deceive us but can also tell the truth when they want to. More on that next week. It is, however, already in the 6th century BC, in the philosophers Xenophanes and Heraclitus in particular, that we see the first appearance of mythos as something more like fanciful tale opposed to the logos, or the de-anthropomorphized account of nature or the god. Around this time, in some Ionian philosophical circles, Homer and Hesiod come to be treated with suspicion, rather than simply revered as the fountainhead of Greek myth and religion. By the 5th to 4th century BC, the philosopher Plato seems to be using the term mythos in a way that could both mean lie or falsehoods. The poets tell many a lie, as the muses had already warned Hesiod. But it can also mean something like a form of truth. And as we'll see, Plato constructs from historical material many new myths, which he wants us to take seriously, philosophically, and rationally. And in this way, Plato is both a rationalist and a myth maker in his literary dialogues. And this has been much explored in the scholarship. It is only under the influence of the historical tradition that Euhemerus in the 4th to 3rd century BCE argues that myths contain kernels of historical truth that have been distorted over time, and so that myth is a disguised history. During the post-classical or Hellenistic period and the Roman period, we witness a whole panoply of ways of approaching and interpreting myth, first by the Stoic philosophers, for example, but eventually leading by the 2nd to 3rd century CE in the dominance of a Platonic interpretation of myth as sacred allegory. Dominant interpretation that would continue through the rise of Christianity and Islam before being mostly forgotten in its Platonic origins, only to then resurface in the Renaissance. Consensus view of Hellenistic and late antiquity was more or less that myths are allegorical or symbolic forms that encode deep truths about nature, the cosmos, or the human psyche. Until the Renaissance and after, Christian authors tended to use both the allegorical and euhemeristic interpretations of myth in order to read Greco-Roman myth as a degraded form of truth. Christian intellectuals found Greek philosophy's attempts at demythologizing myth, such as in the Pre-Socratics, or other later philosophers, as helpful in defining their own doctrine as literal truth. The attempts to combine allegorical and euhemeristic interpretation to degrade Greek myth goes to some pretty ridiculous extremes, such as in Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, or Tertullian, who all propose the thesis of demonic implication. The word demon or daimon just meant in the Greek context a spirit or lesser god. But for these early Christian interpreters, the daimons of Greek religion, which we'll learn more about in this course, were properly demons. Quote, demons suggested to the poets who create myths that they give Zeus many sons and attribute monstrous adventures to them, in the hope that this would make the story of Christ appear to be a fable of the same sort. Here, much earlier Greek myths are paradoxically read as falsifying history, where their allegorical meaning rests in the demonic attempt to prevent the incarnation of the Savior, and even to lay the groundwork of a compelling systematic demonic vision of the world that attempted well before Christ was ever born to positively thwart any possibility of recognizing this event. Less fantastically, in the New Testament, logos rather than mythos becomes the rational source of scripture and theology, St. John identifying God's word with the incarnate Christ or logos, and this becoming the founding myth, but also a rational truth, one which effaces the very use of the term myth here in order to establish a criterion of literality. Towards the end of the Renaissance, wherein myth was being rediscovered beyond Christianized allegory or euhemeristic reduction, and through to the Romantic reaction to the Enlightenment, Greco-Roman myths in the new European context often became associated with the Edenic condition of humanity, as well as the patriotic and spiritual roots of nations and peoples. There was really a post-Enlightenment myth craze across Europe, which we normally refer to as the Romantic movement. And it was this movement which gradually led to folkish interpretation, which used mythic materials to valorize root languages and races and their national and cultural identity, and so was very often chauvinist. Indeed, this strand of politicized post-Romantic interpretation of myth eventually led to the Nazis' Aryan mythos. More on that later. It is still today the case that the Romantic period and movement, roughly from 1770 to 1830, is the most profusive and labyrinthine for the modern reinvention of myth. Here, not only Greco-Roman, but increasingly global mythic sources as well. Especially in Germany, France, and Great Britain, there are a huge number of original theorists and poets during this period who make their rallying cry around myth. For example, a counterfeit translation of a fictional blind Gaelic bard, Ossian, by James Macpherson became a pan-European sensation. People were so excited to find poems of an ancient Gaelic bard that they took fiction for fact, and illustrious minds all over Europe basically believed this was a manuscript discovery rather than an elaborate forgery and original literary work. The Romantics were indeed looking for mysticism in their myths, and they invariably found it, whether the sources were genuinely historical or fancifully invented. Towards the end of the 19th century, the passionate fervor had cooled off in some circles just enough for the birth of what we call comparative method in studying myth. Alongside these new comparativists, more on them in a moment, there was also this folkish interpretation of myth, often now with romantic nationalist agendas, and this was especially prevalent in Germany in the second half of the 19th century, which saw Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm's work on German grammar, and also a period where the study of fairy tales were becoming more culturally ubiquitous. In music during this period, Richard Wagner reinvented the myths of the Nibelungslide in his Ring Saga, that is, the Germanic dragon-slaying hero Siegfried, and later the Christian hero Parsifal, demanding religious devotion from a new German folk who would define themselves in terms of their new collective artworks of the future. Nietzsche was taken into this mythicizing as a young man and never completely got over it. However, he did switch the script often back to Greco-Roman myth from Germanic Saga. Indeed, despite the complexity of his thinking, as we'll see in this course, there are ethnocentric and sometimes racist passages in Nietzsche that can't be explained away and which show him as a sinister reinventor of myth. For example, when he calls for a return of all true German things in early writings, or mythologizes the Dionysian, Superman, or Aryan blonde beast in some later writings. Transformation of mythology we find in Germany from the Romantics to Nietzsche very much defined the field of myth studies in ways we're still dealing with today. Generally against, but sometimes in alliance with this cultural context, early comparativists such as Sir James Frazer, Carl Jung, Mircea Eliade, despite their breaking down the bias in favor of Greek, Roman, and Nordic myth, continue to speak of primitive and primal peoples who still believe in their myths. And it wasn't until the close of the 20th century that academic method in the comparative study of myth demanded of researchers a less ethnocentric tone. Particularly useful theoretical tools for the study of myth we can find in William Doty's toolkit, in his book Mythography, the Study of Myths and Rituals, since he lays out the distinctiveness of social, psychological, literary, textual, or performative, structural, and political interpretations of myth. It is from Bruce Lincoln that we get the so-called narrative identity theory of myth, that is, that myth is ideology in narrative form. In his book Theorizing Myth, Narrative, Ideology, Scholarship, receive a lucid argument redefining the human being as homo narrans, that is, the storytelling animal. We're basically hardwired to always find coherent patterns of meaning in everything. And through this process, we construct our identity around founding myths, that is, the stories we tell ourselves. While most religious studies scholars and comparative mythologists have veered away from the so-called father of comparative religion, Mircea Eliade, especially when it came to his politics, it's still useful and necessary at the beginning of a course like this on classical myth to review some of his basic views. For Eliade, myths satisfy our human yearning for an existential orientation towards the, quote, religious aura of sacred timelessness. There are, in Eliade's conception, two time spaces, sacred and profane time, the time-space of the extraordinary and the time-space of everyday life. The function of myth is to traverse these two times, the sacred and the profane, to bring the extraordinary through ritual back into the ordinary. Sacred time-space is defined by the instituting gestures of the gods and ancestors who live beyond ordinary everyday time, in illo tempore, in his Latin terms here. In contrast, the profane time-space of everyday life undergoes, through ritual hierophanies, the eternal return of an originary mythical time-space. More simply, myth is like the religious sacrament that provides the imagination a spiritual release from historical time and everydayness. This is the function of true myths, which are fundamentally paradigms and explanations for how the sacred is involved in history, both in our individual lives and in society as a whole. The basic function of myth is to delineate and even to evoke events of hierophany. The Greek word hieros, meaning the sacred, and phani, to appear or show forth. A hierophany is an active manifestation of the sacred, that is, an event of immanence of the divine. And it is from out of these moments of hierophany, and in relation to them, that world historical peoples discover and transmit their founding myths. You can see here on the left the 3 titles of Eliade books most relevant to the study of myth in a course like ours, although there are of course many others. Although quite overstated, always worth a mention in Surveys of Theories of Myth is Max Muller and his theory of the core of myth as nature myths. After Muller, it was pretty common to interpret myths as somehow in tune with the logic of nature, its seasons, meteorological developments, or cosmological phenomena. And it's pretty amazing how far you can get with this approach. True, some myths are nature myths, and certain gods, for example Zeus, represent or control the sky and other parts of the natural order. Yet it is just as true that a great many more myths have no such relationship to nature, is how our textbook puts this. Exactly where nature, or the Greek physis, begins or ends, and how it relates myth and allegory, is in fact a very complicated topic, and it's still well worth looking into Max Muller on these points. Although dated and out of fashion, when we read James Frazer's The Golden Bough, for instance, we're indebted in large part to Muller's interpretation of all myths as, in essence, allegorical nature myths. More influential for how the average modern human actually thinks about Greek myths is Freud's interpretation, especially his take on the Oedipus myth. The textbook sums this up. Among Freud's greatest contributions are his emphasis upon sexuality, and in particular infantile sexuality, his theory of the unconscious, his interpretation of dreams, and his identification of the Oedipus complex. Contemporary attitudes towards Freud and Freudian psychoanalysis tend to be simultaneously deeply dismissive, but at the same time deeply indebted to Freud. His interpretations of Greek myths could be a bit of a stretch, but they were always interesting and illuminating of aspects of those myths which had hardly been noticed previously. For example, on the myth of Oedipus, Freud writes, quote, "His fate moves us only because it might have been our own, because the oracle laid upon him before our birth the very curse which rested upon him. It may be that we are all destined to direct our first sexual impulses towards our mothers, and our first impulses of hatred and resistance towards our fathers. Our dreams convince us that this is so. King Oedipus, who slew his father Laius, wedded his mother Jocasta, is nothing more or less than a wish fulfillment, the fulfillment of the wish of our childhood. But we, more fortunate than he, insofar as we have not become psychoneurotics, have since our childhood succeeded in withdrawing our sexual impulses from our mothers and in forgetting the jealousy of our fathers. As the poet brings the guilt of Oedipus to light by his investigation, he forces us to become aware of our own inner selves, in which the same impulses are still extant, even though they are suppressed. The most canonical form of the Oedipus myth that we have is in Sophocles' tragedy. Note here that the core function of myths in psychic life have ever to do with resolving psychic conflict as well as with wish fulfillment. So myths are ever in the twilight zone, between conscious contents with which it is possible to live, in the realm of the unconscious, accessible in dreams, and expressed in myths. Myths are part of what Freud calls the dream work. That is, dreams, like myths, are fulfillments of wishes that have been repressed and disguised. The process of mythic formation becomes identified with the process of psychic health and catharsis. To protect our sleep and relieve anxiety, the mind goes through the process of dream work. First, the disturbing elements are condensed, abbreviated, or compressed. Next, they are displaced, but is changed in their meanings in accordance with certain allusions or differences of emphasis. And last, the disturbing elements are represented, that is transmitted into imagery or symbols, many and varied and often sexual. These three elements of what Freud calls the dream work, condensation, displacement, and representation, could be powerfully applied to the origin and evolution of myth. And for Freud, myths like the dream work thus provide insight into the human mind, as well as into the methods of the creative artist. In Freud's interpretation, myths reflect people's waking efforts to systematize the incoherent vision and impulses of their sleep world. In Freud's classically problematic Victorian approach here, the imaginative world of children, savages, and neurotics are similar, but they reveal the same patterns, motifs, or symbols of myth. Rather than dismiss Freud out of hand, we must note that Freud's theory works very well for a great many specifically Greek myths, especially Theseus versus the Minotaur, Oedipus and Electra, and Hesiod's myth of succession, and many others. But it is true that at times Freud goes a bit too far, such as in his 1922 essay, The Medusa Complex, where he identifies Medusa's decapitated head with male castration and the snakes with male genitalia. There must be other ways to read this myth too, no? We'll find a few later in this course. Of course, Jung is deeply indebted to Freud's approach, but famously argues with Freud's concept of libido, that is, that all the expressions of culture are fundamentally reducible to the dynamic unfolding of libidinal energies from the unconscious. Rather than understand the unconscious as a biological libido, Jung understands it as containing primordial contents, or what he calls archetypes. These primordial truth contents or archetypes are not just from the individual unconscious, but the properly collective unconscious of the human species. Indeed, the term archetype in Jung designates the ability to form mythological patterns, and refers only secondarily to any particular mythological image or motif. The personal unconscious is important, but concerns only the matters of one's individual life. It is in the collective unconscious that we find the collectively dreamed group symbols that are myths or archetypes, and even their cosmic truth. For Jung, the Oedipus complex was the first archetype that Freud discovered, but there are many such archetypes in Greek mythology and in dreams. If you're interested in Jung, you can also check out another video of mine, another course on Jung's Red Book. In relation to the archetypes of the collective unconscious, the path of individual human life is one of individuation, a conscious coming to terms with one's own inner center or self. Note importantly, because this is so frequently misunderstood, individuation does not involve achieving the archetype so much as achieving independence from it. Power of the archetype in the collective unconscious in human individual life is disturbing and produces psychic symptoms. We are all involved in these archetypes of the collective unconscious. As we mature, develop, and grow through the process of individuation, we learn to achieve independence from the archetypal contents. That is, the myth becomes something we lived in the past rather than something that is living through us in the present. Of course, the only safe relation to the dangerous volatility of myth. The threefold process of individuation for Jung involves meeting certain archetypes, above all, the shadow, the animus or anima, and the self. In both our dreams and in mythologically patterned tales, we indeed always find these archetypes. The shadow, usually a gruesome monster, the animus or man in a woman, the anima or woman in a man, and the self, usually figured as a wise old man or woman, or the great mother, a child, the cosmic couple, or a helpful animal, and many other forms. Anima-animus images tend to be opposite sex figures reflecting the power of the mother complexes or the father complexes, and perhaps guiding to the self, that is, if the anima-animus relation is positive in the individual. There are further 4 stages in the anima-animus myth according to Jung's model. Men who express the masculine animus pursue in themselves the female anima in 4 basic forms corresponding to the 4 stages of spiritual maturation or individuation. This is here a bit like Diotima's ladder of love, moving from more physical to more spiritual forms of love. First, the biological level, the babe, next the romantic, followed by the spiritual, and then the abstract. Similarly, in women, the biological level might be expressed by the jungle hero, followed by a more suitable romance, or a spiritual animus, man as the bearer of the word, or even an abstract one, the animus as a guide to spiritual truth. All these complexities within Jungian psychology are richly developed in his work, and we don't have time to get into them here. Jungian concepts here have been fruitfully applied not only in myth studies, but also in art history and theory. For example, the rounded curves of this 4th stage anima image by Gabor Tari are supposed to evoke the flowing power of the ancient Sibyl, a priestess of Apollo prophesizing the future from Delphi. Jungian archetypes can indeed be quite fruitful and personally enriching ways to approach Greco-Roman myth, and I'll often return to Carl Karenyi's Jungian interpretations of particular myths as this course proceeds. Of course, the discussion of all the different fascinating theories of myth and Greco-Roman myth in particular that are out there could go on for weeks. The careful student of myth should be familiar with Fraser's The Golden Bow, Tyler's theory of animism. Especially relevant for this course is Jane Harrison's Prolegomena to the study of Greek religion and Themis, known as the Cambridge Ritual School interpretation of myth, which we'll meet again and again applied to various myths in our textbook. The comparative ethnographer may want to brush up on Malinowski's concept of myth as social charters, but of all the theories of myth that have been mentioned, the one I'll be privileging most in this course is the philosophical interpretation of myth, or the field known as philosophy of mythology, which I'll supplement across this course with a good dose of Jungian interpretation of myth. Texts in the course pack reflecting a philosophical engagement with Greek and Roman mythology are various. We'll do a close reading of Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy, of Walter Otto's The Homeric Gods and Dionysus, Myth and Cult, and even, by the end, of Friedrich Schelling's later philosophy of mythology. The textbook doesn't go too much into the philosophical study of Greek myth, but moves in a more humanistic lens from Jungian interpretations to structuralist ones. And so we should say just a few words about these theories before completing our toolbox of the various theories of myth. Congratulations, everyone. We're almost at the end of the dense and difficult History of Theories of Myth portion. Last up, the textbook goes into further detail on structuralist and post-structuralist approaches, and also the formalism of prop. All the myth theories studied above, and these as well, are important for our course, especially for when you eventually get around to defining your essay topics, but also to choose and critique an interpretation to guide you. For example, let's say you get really into the Oedipus myth. For your secondary or theory source, you could pick up Claude Lévi-Strauss's essay, The Structural Study of Myth, all about the Oedipus myth, of course. And then voila, checkmark. You've got the theory of myths portion of your assignment covered. The last figure we won't go into here, because they'll keep cropping up again and again, is Walter Burkert, an amazing classicist who synthesizes the structural and historical points of view in the study of myth. For real keeners, if you pick up his book Greek Religion, you'll be light years ahead of the rest of us as we work through our textbook and the various materials for this course. And his book on ancient mystery religions I would recommend for an essay topic. Whichever of the above or other theories of myth you choose to focus on in those assignments for which you need a theory, that's fine, but be warned. Few things make your professor's eyes roll more than to stubbornly hunker down in the view that the point of a Greek or Roman myth class is to rehearse the basic stages of the hero's journey. Read, if you must, Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, or even Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning. Just please don't treat Campbell's monomyth as your one-trick pony. It doesn't get us very far. Informed, critical approaches to Campbell or to Peterson on hero myth or to the heroine's journey, of course, are all allowed, but you would have to make sure they're actually well researched. For example, presentations that just walk us through the hero's journey, applied to a given body of hero legend, is not going to earn you a passing grade. When in doubt, check with me. I'm happy to help find you the best sources. Having just said that, at the same time, I'm aware that the academic study of myth can be quite difficult, and that there is great value in books pitched at the right level that help us to engage personally and psychologically. Accordingly, I've assigned as the basic default for your presentation topics these two books by Jean Shinoda Bolen. You can get both or pick either one, and then focus your class presentation on one chapter within it. Sign up for that in week 3. Although the titles are a bit new agey, to be sure, these are both excellent, well-researched studies that really bring the personal and therapeutic dimensions of the study of Greek myth home. And I think everyone's going to enjoy them a lot. This will definitely be a breath of fresh air every week, alongside our textbook chapters and other course materials. Just be warned with these books that they're a bit heteronormative and formed in the Jungian tradition, thinking about anima and animus. Don't worry, we'll also be getting to LGBTQI+ interpretations of myth, alongside Helen Morales as the course proceeds. So that being a decent segue, let's turn now to topics that I'm sure you'll find more exciting. That is gender and sexuality in Greek myth. The textbook begins here by noting that social criticism of the male-centered world of Greek mythology goes back at least to Sappho, the ancient lesbian poetess, who, in her hymn to Aphrodite, used the image of Homeric warfare to describe her emotions, and in a poem on Anactoria, contrasts what she loves, another human being, with what conventional men love, the panoply of war. In 1942, the French philosopher Simone Weil took basically the same approach in her essay on the Iliad, or the poem of force, focusing on the issues of violence, power, and domination that are fundamental to Homeric mythology. More recently, in this genre of feminist reinterpretations of Greek myth, we can point to Anne Carson's book Eros the Better Sweet. If your interest is feminist interpretations of Greek myth, definitely consider working on Anne Carson's Sappho. And we'll return to this later in the course. Other themes our textbook goes on to address very problematically, as we'll see in a moment, is the theme of rape in Greek society and myth. Let's talk first about the role of women in Greek and Roman society. Indeed, Greek mythology, even though it's predominantly male-parsed, affords an abundance of opportunity to think about female goddesses and the role of women in myth and religion. Women participated in many festivals and religious rituals of their own, and we find in the canon of Greek myth some rare examples of feminine perspective, such as the Homeric hymn to Demeter, told almost entirely from the point of view of the women characters, or the sorceress Medea, or Cassandra, the daughter of Agamemnon. The textbook notes that the view that women were not allowed citizenship is false, at least in classical Athens, but it's true they were denied the right to vote, that is to participate in public assembly and the political economic world governed by men. Women's position in society, their education, and their freedoms varied greatly. You can note that there were 4 basic classes for women in ancient Greek society. First and most respected position to attain is that of a priestess in a temple. Next, to be the wife of a prominent citizen was a pretty enviable position to have. The third class of women traverses the gambit from high-class courtesan, a hetaira, which is also a pretty envied position, hetaira often being very well educated, civilized, and cultured, to a low-class prostitute, or pornoi, from which we get the word porno. Lastly, there were the class of women slaves. At this point, the textbook seems to hold up a somewhat idealized image of the status of women in ancient Greek city-states, and Athens in particular. Drawing on the work of Joan Connolly, Portrait of a Priestess, we hear that in Athens, a woman citizen benefited greatly from the prosperity and the artistic expression and freedom of the democracy and empire. Women were very important in religious ceremonies, some of which excluded the participation of males. Women did not always walk outdoors veiled. A few became intoxicated, some had affairs, and many were outspoken about their own inferior position as citizens in relation to that of the males. Amazingly so for this period of time in the history of Western civilization. According to the textbook, Joan Connolly reveals how, quote, the broadly accepted commonplace that Athenian women held wholly second-class status as silent and submissive figures, restricted to the confines of the household, where they obediently tended to domestic chores and child-rearing, has been in recent years successfully challenged and proven to be false by an impressive array of scholarly research. The argument here hinges on the difference between invisibility, that is, in the sources which survive, which are mostly written by men, versus oppression, as well as the difference of separation, men and women's roles being quite segregated in Greek society, versus seclusion. The textbook concludes, Connolly convincingly argues that there is more than enough evidence, fragmentary though it may be, to prove that priestesses spoke before assemblies, fixed their seals on official documents, and at least by Hellenistic times and maybe earlier, took their honored places in the front rows of the theater, instead of highlighting women who led public processions, made dedications in sanctuaries, and stepped forward on festal days to perform rituals and initiate sacrifices. The focus has rested on women locked indoors. Now, I don't think any of this is strictly disputable, but I worry a bit about the apologistic tone. Sure, we can focus on the lives of priestesses and prominent wives when studying Greek mythology and society. The fact remains that the majority of women do not live out their existence in such coveted positions. Of course, this applies as well to the majority of men in a Greek city-state, only a small percentage of which were citizens. Still, it's hard to imagine any class of being quite so abused in our surviving sources as the Greek female slave, who often seems to suffer indignities far surpassing that of her male counterpart. We'll have to, of course, revisit these topics in specific myths as we proceed. In the meantime, if you'd like lively novelistic re-envisionings from the point of view of female protagonists and the feminine, these are 3 great novels you could pick up, each of which might become the basis of an essay. Having addressed in broadest outline the place of women in Greek society, we have to now address the most disturbing problem of all in approaching Greek mythology, which is the theme of rape. Little disclaimer here, I chose this textbook because I really think it's very good, succinct, well-informed, full of excellent pictures, containing great translations of primary sources, and perfectly arranged for introductory purposes, especially if your interest is the ritual or religious context of myth. On the other hand, I'm completely appalled. The subsection, the theme of rape, is properly disturbing. I haven't checked if it's been removed or modified in the 11th edition, but it definitely needs to be. Note first the infelicitous language choice with which it begins, quote, a fertile and seminal topic has become the theme of rape. Yikes, I think I know where they're going with this, but do they know how that sounds? Fertile and seminal is a way of introducing the theme of rape in Greek mythology? That's just so wrong that it almost undermines the credibility of the authors of this text. Next, they ask, what are we today to make of the many classical myths of ardent pursuit, as well as those of amorous conquest? Are they religious stories? Are they love stories? Or are they, in the end, all fundamentally horrifying tales of victimization? Well, that's a fair question. The textbook, however, goes on, In Ovid's Metamorphoses, Apollo's pursuit of Daphne is the first of the love stories in the poem. To some, it is a beautiful idyll, to others, a glorification of male supremacy and brutality. Okay, so far so good, but listen to what comes next. Quite simply put, it can mean whatever one wants it to mean. Double yikes. Again, it does not seem that the authors of the textbook are tone-sensitive at all in regards to the discussion of the theme of rape. And that's not all, the textbook goes on. Certainly it has been one of the most popular themes among artists throughout the centuries because it is subject to so many varied, overt, and subtle interpretations, primary among them not necessarily being that of rape in the sense of the word today. This is an allusion to, that is saying without saying, coveted classics professor distinction of the difference between rape and abduction. Morford, Leonardon, and Sham go on. The case is similar in the history of music. The very first opera was Daphne, and she has been a profound spiritual inspiration in the years to follow. Well, yes, that's true, but someone needs to teach these people about the rhetorical construction of their sentences. From a fertile and seminal topic, through to rape myth can mean whatever you want it to mean. To, well, in Daphne's case, it wasn't really rape in the modern sense of the word. To, this victim's taking it is a profound and spiritual inspiration, the founding myth of opera, and of wonderful art since. There are some serious problems here, and this is just how the textbook introduces the topic. Next, we hear that the Greeks and Romans were fascinated with the phenomena of blinding passion and equally compulsive virginity. Well, that's definitely true. The passion was usually evoked by the mighty gods Aphrodite and Eros, who could gloriously uplift or pitilessly devastate a human being and a god. The equally ruthless force of chastity was symbolized by devotion to Artemis. Usually, but by no means always, the man defines lust and the woman chastity. In the case of Hippolytus and Phaedra, among others, these roles are reversed. This is basically true, but again, important to note in the myth of Phaedra and Hippolytus, which we'll get to eventually, Phaedra attempts to rape Hippolytus but fails, then accuses Hippolytus of being the attempter. The textbook makes it sound the mere existence of female sexual aggressors levels the playing field somehow. And yet, depictions of female aggressors in the history of Greek mythology and Western art are very hard to find. I certainly couldn't find one of Phaedra's attempted rape of Hippolytus when I looked. This was the closest thing I could get. The textbook goes on that the motif of pursuit by the lover of the beloved, with the implicit imagery of the hunter and the hunted, is everywhere and becomes formulaic in Greek myth, with the pursuit ending in ritualistic acquiescence or the saving of the pursued from a fate worse than death, often through a metamorphosis. But then the textbook goes on to again use the exception to try to undermine the rule when it says the consummation of sex need not be part of the scenario of this ancient motif, played upon with versatile sophistication by a civilized poet such as Ovid. Barf. So when Ovid approaches rape with his versatile sophistication, it doesn't even need to be rape, simply a myth of conflictual desire, ending in transformation. Well, that makes it PG, I guess, right? Next, the textbook notes correctly that many seduction scenes in Greek myth are ultimately religious in nature, and the fact that it is a god who seduces a mortal can make all the difference. Zeus may single out a chosen woman to be the mother of a divine child or hero for a grand purpose intended for the ultimate good of the world, and the woman may or may not be overjoyed. Take one for the team, I guess? These tales are told from different points of view, sometimes diametrically opposed. And next we hear that in Greek culture, religion, and mythology, there is no real distinction between the love, abduction, or rape of a woman by a man or of a man by a woman. On these points, the textbook sounds a lot like the classic scholar Mary Lefkowitz. Yep, the same woman who wrote a book debunking Afrocentrist studies, when she writes, in the case of myths involving the unions of gods and goddesses with mortal men and women, we should talk about abduction or seduction rather than rape, because the gods see to it that the experience, however transient, is pleasant for mortals. That's Western rape culture if we've ever read it. And it's actually not always true in the case of Greek myth. Moreover, she goes on, the consequences of these unions are usually glorious for the families of the mortals involved, despite and even because of the suffering that the individual members of the family may undergo. The ubiquity of images of rape in Greek culture and mythology, and thus Western civilization, cannot be underestimated. As we'll learn next week with Roberto Colasso and Helen Morales, the founding myth of European civilization is a Greek myth about the rape of Europa, when Zeus in the form of a bull comes to carry her away. Not that I'm in support of putting trigger warnings on everything, The study of Greek myth definitely needs a warning of some kind. Finding consensual sex scenes can be a bit like a Where's Waldo. Male personified winds rape female ones. The god Apollo rapes Daphne. Hades rapes Persephone. Paris rapes Helen. Or does he? Greeks rape Amazons. Achilles and Agamemnon rape Briseis and Croesus. Men or gods rape boys. And satyrs in the retinue of Dionysus rape just about everyone. It is only in the very recent history of Western fine art such rape scenes from classical mythology come to be depicted, minus their glorification. As in the brilliant canvases of The Rape of Io by Tony Sherman. This probably resembles more what the Greek myth is actually telling us. And just to roast the textbook one last time here, before moving on to another topic, these Greeks and Romans explored countless issues and emotions, among them passion and lust, and now really let this part sink in, as burning for them, both men and women, as they are for us. Well, the textbook means here burning issues and emotions. Given the topic, it's literally saying, don't worry, those ancient Greek and Roman men and women were as burning to rape as we are. Goes on, quote, we are no less obsessed with the subject of sex than were the ancients, and our depictions certainly can be much more violent and ugly, yet often not so potent. Critics of classical mythology in previous generations sometimes chose not to see the rape. Some critics today choose to see nothing else. This section of the textbook seems pretty shameful to me. For a corrective, I recommend you look up Rebecca Levinton's short article, Rape by Any Other Name, Against Teaching Abductions in Greek Art. Reading textbooks just like this in art history, she learned as a graduate student to, quote, label all sorts of attacks within the broader lexicon of Greek violence, just as the battles of the Olympian gods against the Titans became the gigantomachy, the aggression of heroic nude Greek men against these short-skirt women became amazonomachy. Without a knowledge or vocabulary of othering, my freshman self found this distancing terminology all very comforting. The same went for scenes of individual women being seized. I even remember as a senior confidently reassuring a younger student not to be alarmed by the presence of the word rape on a lecture handout. It means something different here, just abduction. I happily consumed this terminological Kool-Aid well into my graduate studies in Greek and Roman art. On this question of studying Greek myth and Western rape culture, the question still remains, can we even study classical mythology without being indoctrinated into Western rape culture? If not, should we, quote, cancel the study of classical mythology? On this, the textbook is really tepid, probably because it rightly feels its discipline to be under threat. Quote, the same tale may embody themes of victimization and rape or sexual love or spiritual salvation, one or all of these issues or more. Well, this is correct, but in the context of the rhetoric we've read, it's gross and necessary that we do a bit better in approaching classical mythology, especially if we don't want this class to get cancelled. Here, Levitin takes aim firmly at Lefkowitz. Quote, enough with abductions. In our teaching and in our scholarship, let's call a spade and a rape a rape. This issue of the pervasiveness of indoctrinating rape culture in Greek myth leads to the broader issue of whether we should cancel the classics in general. Helen Morales writes, classical, like classics, is also a value-laden term. Think of the connotations of classical music, classic beauty, classic cars. The myths of different cultures have been given different valences by their reception in so-called Western and non-Western culture. Those of ancient Greece and Rome have become the myths of the Western world. The label classical acknowledges and reinforces their cultural supremacy over myths of, say, ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and India. At the same time, it masks the Eurocentrism of this tradition. There's a smugness about the word and a pretension to timeless and effortless superiority. We'll be returning to this issue with Helen Morales and the Black Athena controversy, a topic not so charged thanks to the verdict of history, but not without trigger warnings of its own, is that of male and female homosexuality in Greek society and myth. Homosexuality was accepted and accommodated as a part of life in the ancient world. There were no prevailing hostile religious views that condemned it as sin. And this is why Greek male homosexuality rightfully takes pride of place in the history of homosexuality and homophobia, as in these studies on the right. However, the textbook sounds a note of caution. While homosexuality was accepted in Greek city-states, there are strict rules surrounding it. For example, in the ancient Greek institution of pederasty, no, not pedophilia, the term pederasty being used here to distinguish it from pedophilia, like the term abduction being used instead of the term rape. In any case, in pederasty, and this may be the triggering bit for some, an older male became the lover of a younger man if the primary motive was, at least ostensibly, education of a higher order, the molding of character, and responsible citizenship. Longer homosexual relationships between two mature men, promiscuity, and effeminacy were not so readily accepted. The most famous examples of homosexuality in Greek myth include myths of Zeus and Ganymede, Poseidon and Pelops, Apollo and Hyacinthus, Apollo and Cyparissus, and the friendship of Achilles and Patroclus, as well as Heracles and Hylas. The scholars Lear and Cantarella note that, quote, the sexual life of the ancient Greeks was as variegated and inventive as its resplendent culture. It was neither consistent nor uniform. To this day, it stubbornly resists all modern ideologies and prejudices, and yet had its own principles of decency and sex. As in so much else, the ancient Greeks were unique. On the topic of female homosexuality in Greek society and myth, we hear that it's just as important a theme as male homosexuality, but not as clearly visible. Sappho, a lyric poetess from the island of Lesbos in the 6th century BC, evokes Aphrodite's help to win back the love of a young woman with whom she has been involved, and her relationships with women are evident both in other poems and in the biographical tradition. From Sappho, we get the term lesbian from the island of Lesbos, as well as the association of Aphrodite with lesbian love. Lesbianism might also be a latent motif, for example, in stories about the strong bond of affection among Artemis and her band of followers, as well as in the depiction of the society and mores of the warlike Amazons. However, like male homosexuality, a lot of rules surrounded female homosexuality as well. Quote, laws strictly enforced marriage, rewarded childbearing, and promoted the family as the core of the city-state, and anyone who did not comply was stigmatized in various ways. Yet, homosexuality, both male and female, practiced within the bonds of societal demands, was encouraged and respected. If this is a topic you'd like to do your final essays on, any of these 4 studies come highly recommended. So after all this situating and legwork, the textbook finally arrives at its definition of classical myth. Classical myth is, quote, a story that, through its classical form, has attained a kind of immortality, because its inherent archetypal beauty, profundity, and power have inspired rewarding renewal and transformation by successive generations. Each generation recreates these myths, for example, the versions of Oedipus by Seneca, Corneille, von Hofmannsthal, and Cocteau, or the longevity in art and literature of the Orpheus myth. From a Greek vase painting to a Picasso, from a frieze of ancient dancers to a reinterpretation by Isadora Duncan, from the lost music of ancient theater to modern opera, Greek myth, quote, enjoys a miraculous afterlife, in German, Nachleben. In fact, the creation of classical myth has never really stopped, but from the time of Homer, it has constantly been reborn and revitalized, expressed in new ways through literature, art, music, dance, and film. This is all fair stuff, but note the glorifying tone, which in the study of Greek and Roman myth can get us into a bit of trouble, as we'll see in a minute when we turn to Walter Friedrich Otto. Another housekeeping item to guide your studies in Greek and Roman myth, let's talk a tiny bit about sources, resources, and traditions. There are 2 super important online resources which you may want to utilize as you proceed through this course and for your assignments. For the real keeners, there's the PerseusTufts.edu digital library, which contains the entire canon of Greek and Roman writings. More for everyone, and a website you'll probably use quite a bit in this course is theoi.com. Theos, theoi being the Greek word for God and the gods. This website is comprehensive but specifically devoted to Greek mythology. For each figure in Greek mythology, you can find a web page which contains a brief introduction and all the citations regarding that figure from the entire breadth of Greco-Roman myth. This website is fun to use and will be really useful in crafting presentations and looking for primary sources. Note on what is called primary versus secondary versus tertiary sources for the purposes of assignments like your presentation or your final essay. The first thing to note is that a given myth in its archaic to late antique source is what we can call a primary source for the purpose of this class. Scholarly interpretations by qualified experts are secondary sources, and you'll need both a primary and a secondary source, or sometimes more than one, for several assignments in this course. However, this way of framing things can be a bit too tidy in some cases. Even for the Greek authors and artists we study, what they considered their primary sources was a matter of historical distance. Sometimes a century was enough. And so when you study the afterlife or Nachleben of Greek myth in art or philosophy, etc., the way of approaching what you call a primary and a secondary source can change a bit. Here, the work of art or philosophy becomes the primary source. Lastly, tertiary sources like Wikipedias or web page articles, or even your professor's lectures, should only be used to help you frame basic knowledge of something. and fill in some of the factual details, but they don't count as either primary or secondary sources. Each of our textbook chapters is laid out in such a way that it begins from secondary overview, interpretation, and then cites primary sources at length and goes on to interpret them. It's important, therefore, at the get-go to have a sense of the scope of primary sources that we'll be using in the study of Greek myth, although the textbook will mostly be coordinating these for us. The most important primary sources include Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey from the 8th century BCE, Hesiod's Theogony and Works and Days from the 7th century BCE, the Homeric hymns, which are often dated variously, the lyric poet tradition, such as Pindar, Archilochus, Sappho, or Simonides, and others, the surviving Greek tragedies, that is, plays by writers like Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, followed by Apollonius Rhodes' Argonautica in the 3rd century BCE. Next, important sources for the study of myth include Plato and other philosophers, and the early and later historians, figures like Herodotus and Thucydides, are also relevant for the study of myth. Lastly, later mythographers, authors in many fields, and artists can help to fill out our picture of specific Greek myths or mention ones we don't hear elsewhere in the canon, which is in the travel writings of Pausanias or Apollodorus' Library of Mythology, and many others. Primary sources for the study of Roman myth include Virgil's Aeneid and many other writings. The 1st century BCE, Ovid's Metamorphoses is central, as well as his other writings such as Ars Amatoria on the nature of love, or his unfinished manuscript on the Roman festival calendar, the Fasti, as well as Seneca's Tragedies and Flaccus's Argonautica are very important. Perhaps most interesting, and a text we'll actually get to in this course, is Apuleius' Metamorphosis, or the Golden Ass, the 2nd century CE. And lastly, we'll on occasions have recourse to Hyginus' Fables, as a schoolboy Roman compendium of Greek myth, containing some myths we find nowhere else, like the Care Fable. We should note that there are a bewildering array of translations to choose from for most all of these primary sources, and each one can give a different flavor. Sometimes the same details in a myth are unrecognizable from one translation to another. In this course, I'll usually consult a few translations alongside our textbook. And again, it's very helpful if you pick up the Athanakis' translations of Hesiod, the Homeric hymns, and the Orphic hymns, as then you'll have the core primary sources we'll be working from in what I think is probably a better translation than our text. Okay, last up for this week, just about 10 minutes left. Let's talk about Walter Friedrich Otto's The Homeric Gods, which you can find in the course pack or in the modules. As you will already have surmised from our overview of gender, sex, and rape in Greek religion, myth, and society, the politics of studying classical mythology in the 21st century can get pretty edgy. Rather than avoid these kinds of issues in our study of Greek myth, I figure we should tackle them head on. And that's part of my motivation of assigning in the course pack a variety of chapters for us to study from Walter Friedrich Otto's book, The Homeric Gods, The Spiritual Significance of Greek Religion, in the original German subtitle, The Image of the Divine in the Mirror of the Greek Spirit. This book was published in 1929 and is very unfortunately out of print. In it, we find Otto reading Greek polytheism philosophically and ontologically, that is, having to do with being, truth, presence, ideas, and with fundamental religious experiences. The great classics scholar Martin P. Nilsson thought the book was delusional for its mysticism. Edith Hamilton, however, praised it for its religious fervor. Even Walter Burkert took the book seriously as one of the most philosophical readings of Greek religion yet attempted. A reading in which the Greek gods function as what philosophers call the absolute and the Urphenomena, that is, the primordial appearance of being. A little bit about the background of W.F. Otto. He was a southern German, admitted to the prestigious Tübingen Stift. Had some pretty illustrious students a century earlier, such as the German Romantic poet Friedrich Hölderlin and the philosophers Schelling and Hegel. Like them, Otto didn't last long in his formation to Protestant theology, what got taught at the Stift, but after 2 semesters switched to classical philology and transferred to the University of Bonn. For 20 years, Otto worked primarily on Roman literature and culture, which is odd because he's principally remembered for his later works as a Hellenist. By 1913, age 39, he was an ordinarius, assistant professor at Basel, but soon transferred to the University of Frankfurt, where he developed a close friendship with the major classical studies scholar Karl Reinhardt. In the picture on the top right here, you even see him on friendly terms with Carl Jung. But, and now here comes the politically controversial part, in 1934, the Nazi regime forced Otto to accept the offer to serve as a successor to Paul Mass, who was removed from his position for being of Jewish descent. From 1933 to 1945, Otto was a member, and from 1935, the administrator of the Scientific Committee of the Nietzsche Archive. Nietzsche, you'll remember in this period, was the official philosopher of National Socialism, which doesn't mean that Otto's own interpretations had a Nazi flavor. It does, like Heidegger, place him squarely in the intellectual context of overeducated elite Germans who were fellow travelers in some sense with the rise of National Socialism, even if at times critical of their ideology. In 1939 and 40, he, together with Reinhardt and Grassi, published a yearbook entitled Spiritual Tradition. And in the introduction, Otto expressed his concern regarding the destiny of the classics. These remarks seem to have been Nazi-critical enough that the yearbook was subsequently banned by the government. Otto came under persecution by the Nazis, in fact, and was able to flee to Königsberg in 1944. Although in the process he lost all of his possessions, including his personal library and manuscripts. From that point until the end of the Second World War, Otto found refuge in Bavaria, where he entertained the local community with lectures and small theatrical performances. And that brings us to Otto at the end of World War II. After the war, Otto was able to secure a position as a substitute teacher, first in Munich, then in Göttingen, later in Tübingen as a visiting professor. He was eventually able to settle in, found good working conditions and students, and taught for a very long time, publishing many interesting works and dying at the age of 83. Wiki attempts to sum up his perspective when it writes, in his work on Greek religion and mythology, Otto emphasized the rational aspects of classical mythology. Faith of the ancient Greeks was a kind of, quote, religion of objective realization. Alas, what's usually thought to be his magnum opus, Theophania from 1959, has remained untranslated. It was misinterpreted and attacked by Christian theologians in the German context, where it was perceived, like Otto's earlier work, to be reviving classical religion. However, Otto himself described such an interpretation as absurd. To get a grasp of the paradoxes and ambiguities in W.F. Otto's reception, you can look next to the Amazon review of his book Homeric Gods, which is titled Genius, Genius, Monstrously Flawed. The reviewer writes, in many ways, this is incomparably the best guide ever written to Greek and especially Homeric religious ideas. However, it is marred by Otto's fantastically idolatrous attitude towards the Greeks. We would believe much more readily in their greatness if he did not remind us of it so often. There is hardly a page without its shower of superlatives about Greek inventiveness, joyousness, brilliance, and put at that in such an infelicitous way as to suggest rather a 13-year-old schoolgirl with a bad case of Schwärmerei rather than an authoritative scholar, Schwärmerei being delusional romantic dreaming. With this goes an ill-conceived contempt for everything that is not Greek, especially for anything that can be labeled as Oriental, expressed this time in the language of pompous professorial vagueness. The review concludes, it is an unfortunate fact that this magnificent, imaginative recreation of the Greek mind is a direct product of his völkisch and immoralistic philosophy. I guess we're dealing with some controversial stuff here, which I hope makes reading Otto a little bit more interesting for us. The introduction to the work, which you can read in the course pack this week, starts out pretty good. For us moderns, the ancient Greeks are harder to understand than we think. If we are intelligent enough to educate ourselves about Greek religion, our natural response becomes one of admiration and awe, thrill, and the intimation of eternal truths. But the depth of Greek religious ideas and experience is simply outside most of our experience. We tend to approach Greek religion as fantastical myth rather than as religion per se. The naturalness or earthiness of Greek religion seems unspiritual to us moderns, trained as we are either in religions of transcendence or in atheistic secularism. We witness in Greek myth soulful devotion, but not what we would understand as spiritual sacrifice or ethics. Muses who sing of immortal delight and mortal sorrow make us anxious, and the Greek gods seem mischievous to us, unredeeming and unredeemed. Although the Greek mystery traditions and Orphism, which we'll study later, are actually closer to modern religious sensibilities than we might think, we ourselves lack similarly widespread cults of religious initiation. We read Homer as a great tale of heroism, artfully expressed, but we miss how vital and fervent Greek religion actually is in those ancient tales. We try to understand that religious worldview as quaint or spiritually immature. Greek religion is simply too remote from the great Judaic, Christian, Islamic, or Eastern spiritual traditions. So we tend to neglect to understand it and experience it as religion. Paganism has been gone for so long, we no longer know how to engage it as a spiritual and religious alternative to monotheistic faith or secular science. On the Greek gods and their rootedness in nature, or what the Greeks called phusis, Otto is not so immoralistic as his detractors make out. For him, love and existence are rooted in the same ground and are in spirit one. The deepest roots of Greek mythic religion is this theory, love as existence. Of course, the unity of love and existence was revealed to the Greeks quite differently than the Hebrews, the Persians, or the Hindus. Key feature of Greek spirituality for Otto is that it is creative and artistic, but without lacking in reverence and subtlety, or in love. The Greek religious relationship with nature strikes us as powerful but distant. We don't have such powerful personal relationships with natural places and their deities. Although they've been anthropomorphized for us, we nevertheless tend to experience the gods of Greek religion as insufficiently personal. They are not like the one Yahweh who delivers his people. However, divinity is equally transcendent and at times immanent for the Greeks. What tends to be more absent in their religion is the miraculous. Everything, even the gods, emerge from nature. The revelation of the gods is natural and a part of nature. Next in his introduction, Otto wants to underline for us how he's going to read Greek religious phenomena as, quote, objective. What does he mean by this term, objective? Objective in the domain of archaic religion does not mean a calculating intellectual assessment of divine objectivity. Rather, it means that a religious phenomena is experienced as part of the reality of nature, an apprehension of the substance of nature in all its directions, nature's forms and laws, approached with reverence. If this is how he's using the term objective, then it would be hard to argue with this thesis. Greek religious phenomena are objectivist in the sense of locating their religious experience within the reality of nature. On the other hand, it's not like Greek religion lacked subjective elements. For Otto, subjective religion does not mean a merely relativistic personal experience. Rather, it means a mode of thought that is magical, dynamic, powerful, and active in its ability to reveal the extraordinary. Subjective religion, that is, religions privileging the human subject, soul, or self, are not just wonder-appreciating, but wonder-working. Occasionally, Greek myth and religion veers in the direction of subjective religion, for example, in the Neoplatonic practice of magic or theurgy, godcraft. According to Otto, in so-called higher religions, the wonder-working element or subjective aspect of the religion is transferred into belief in a deity who faces the natural world with infinite power and who is incomprehensible. In Hinduism, this becomes the truth of truth, or the Brahman, made possible through the psychic power in man, or the Atman. Rather than fuse objective and subjective religion into higher religion, there are definitive strands of subjective magical thought in ancient Greece, yet on the whole, according to Otto, the culture was hostile to magic. Their religious structures, although complex and varied, mainly attempted, quote, the most magnificent objectivation of the rational mode of thought. In other words, when we approach Greek myth and religion as a whole, the religious element that predominates is the objective one, the statue of Athena by Phidias in the Parthenon, being at times the goddess herself in propria persona, the key piece of evidence that Otto adduces for the predominantly objective character of Greek religion, and that is the phenomena of pan-Hellenic religion. Not just local poets, but Hesiod and Homer, in their overall interpretation and performance, became such an important canonical thing. That is an objective official narrative of divine history and of God's interactions with humans. For Otto, this was a religion that was self-consciously suspicious of the supernatural and tried to naturalize their own religion as universal as far as possible, and it was this same tendency that gave rise to the birth of philosophy. What animated the Greeks' drive to objective religion is, according to Otto, the Greek sense of reality or being. Quote, the ancient Greek religion comprehended the things of the world with the most powerful sense of reality possible, and nevertheless, for that very reason, recognized in them the marvelous delineations of the divine. So far so good, and I can't find too much in Otto to argue with yet, but the next thing he says should give us pause. Quote, in ancient Greek worship, there is revealed to us one of humanity's greatest religious ideas. We make bold to say, the religious idea of European spirit. Here we see that intimate link we'll have to explore of Greek mytho-religious spirit and European spirit. What is this idea of European spirit, you ask? Well, for Otto it is, quote, the faculty of seeing the world in light of the divine. Not a world yearned for, aspired to, or mystically present only in rare ecstatic experiences, but the world into which we are born, part of which we are, interwoven with it through our senses and through our minds, obligated to it for all its abundance and vitality. This birth of the Greek/European spirit is premised for Otto in the Homeric poems. Zeus, Apollo, Athena, Artemis, Dionysus, Aphrodite, wherever the ideas of the Greek spirit are honored, there we must never forget that these were its greatest ideas, indeed, in the sense of the totality of its ideas in general. Well, there's some truth to all this. There is a way of reading these major gods of the Olympic pantheon as indeed the Greeks' greatest ideas, and this we'll have to explore in this course. I would almost have liked Otto to end the sentence there, but look what he goes on to say. And they will endure as long as the European spirit, which in them has attained its most significant objectivation, is not wholly subjugated to the spirit of the Orient or to that of utilitarian rationality. The Nazis haven't even risen to power here in 1929, but this statement here about never being subjugated to the spirit of the Orient or utilitarian rationality clearly situates this intellectual within the political academic context of his day. Obviously, the British and the Americans are exemplars of utilitarian rationality, and we must preserve Western European culture and its purity and ideality over against its barbaric Oriental neighbors. If we applied Edward Said's analysis in Orientalism here, Otto wouldn't emerge looking too good. This is in a way precisely why it's valuable for us to read Otto, to parse out what makes this still one of the best guides ever to Greek myth and religion, versus where it may have gone disastrously wrong. The issue in reading Otto, indeed the issue in studying classical mythology in the West, is well underlined by Helen Morales when she asks, can we live our myths? Clearly that is what Otto is attempting to do, and this constitutes both the value of his work and its limits. Can we today live our myths as well? Morales answers, well, no, or very few of us, at least in the sense implied by the advertisement to this course. Remember the prestige, pleasure, mystique, and fantasy with which the Greek tourism industry greets you as a modern god. Alas, most of us don't play out our lives on such a grand and exaggerated scale as the heroes and heroines of classical myth. We'd probably be locked up if we did. But in any case, stories, events, and people require collective recognition to become mythic. The classical tradition of myth, the history of its interpretation, did indeed acquire such a collective recognition, which is why, in another sense, we are all living classical myths all the time, right here, right now, even when we don't want to, and even when we don't realize it. Classical mythology is so influential in Western culture that everyone who is alive to the art, culture, politics, and languages of today encounters it. Myth mattered for the ancient Greeks and Romans, and it matters for us in understanding who we are, ourselves, our liberties, and our lies. It is this self-understanding which, in the end, is probably the best reason to take and to stick with a rigorous survey course in classical mythology. Okay, that's a wrap for this week, and we'll pick up next week exactly here with the question of Greek spirit as European spirit in earliest times and in our own. When it comes to the question of whether we should cancel the study of classical mythology, and even the classics in general, I'll say, let's stow that question away for now and take a vote on it at the end of the semester. What is the European spirit? What is the classical? And what is the distinctiveness or the universality of Greco-Roman myth? We don't have answers to these questions yet, but hopefully we will by the end of this course. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you all next week